The first time they showed up, they came in golf carts. 3 of them, wearing polo shirts tucked too tight, fake smile plastered on sunburned faces, and clipboards that screamed authority they didn't actually have. The gold HOA committee badges pinned to their chests were meant to intimidate. To me, they just looked like props from a cheap suburban drama. I remember the woman in front, their self-appointed queen bee, Karen Matthews. Her sunglasses were the kind that cost more than the carts they rode in, and her tone could peel paint off wood. "Mr. Cole," she said, leaning out as if my front yard were her stage, "we're here for your scheduled inspection." I looked up from where I was repairing a dock plank on the lake. "Inspection for what?" Karen's smile sharpened. "Your lake violates HOA environmental compliance. We need to make sure it meets community standards." I blinked once, twice, then laughed, one of those slow, disbelieving laughs that start in the gut and end in a growl. "My lake," I said. "You mean the lake?" Her lips curled. "Yes, your lake. The one behind your property. It's technically shared waters, as it borders the Ridgeview community line." That's when I realized what was happening. They thought the lake was part of their homeowners association jurisdiction. They wanted control, fees, power, whatever their greedy little committee could squeeze out of it. But they had no idea, because I didn't just own the lake. I owned everything they were standing on. The valley had been my grandfather's land, 1,800 acres of dense pines, silver creeks, and that glittering lake that caught the sunrise like a mirror. He'd bought it for a song in the 60s, back when no one cared about remote property an hour from the nearest town. Over the years, small parcels were sold off to developers, bit by bit, until the Ridgeview Estates HOA sprouted up like weeds at the valley's edge. What they didn't know, what the county records made clear, was that while their homes were built along the ridge, everything below the slope, from the tree line to the shoreline, was still mine. The HOA map was wrong. Their landscaping easements, misfiled. Their walking trails, on private land. And the lake, that was the heart of it all, completely, indisputably mine. So when Karen and her clipboard brigade tried to inspect it, they were stepping onto private property without permission. I wiped the sawdust from my hands, stood up, and met her stare. "You're trespassing. Leave." Her face froze, then cracked into a laugh that carried that HOA arrogance you could smell from a mile away. "Mr. Cole, you don't seem to understand how Ridgeview works. We're responsible for the community's environmental safety. If you have a standing body of water within 200 feet of the property line, we have the right to inspect it." "You have the what now?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "The right," she repeated, with that clipped tone people use when they think they are talking to someone dumber than them. "The board voted on it." "Did the board also vote to rewrite property law?" She frowned, opening her folder to some printed bylaws, words highlighted in neon. "Sir, you can't just—" I cut her off. "Karen, your bylaws stop at your property lines. This lake isn't yours. You don't have jurisdiction here." She took a step forward, and that's when I pointed, not at her, but at the no trespassing sign by the path, the one she'd driven right past. Her jaw tightened. "We'll see about that." Then she turned to her committee's soldiers and waved a hand like she was commanding troops. "We'll return with law enforcement." I smiled. "You do that." They did. 3 days later, a county deputy showed up at my gate, flashing lights and all, accompanied by the HOA's entire leadership team. Karen looked triumphant, like she'd just won a battle before the war even started. "Mr. Cole," the deputy began, polite but firm, "I received a call about a possible obstruction of inspection. Mind if we talk?" I shrugged. "Sure, long as it's about law and not HOA bylaws." Karen stepped forward. "Officer, this man is refusing a lawful inspection of Ridgeview's shared environmental assets." The deputy's brows furrowed. "Shared assets?" "Yes," she said crisply. "This lake borders our community and—" "Is privately owned," I interrupted, handing the deputy a folded document, filed with the county clerk's office. "Survey maps on page 2. The deputy scanned it, then whistled softly. "This covers a lot of ground." 1,800 acres, I said. "Everything below Ridgeview's southern boundary." including that lake. Karen's smile faltered. That can't be right. Our HOA map. Your HOA map, I said, was drawn by a developer who didn't own what he thought he did. I've got 50 years of title and tax records that prove otherwise. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind rippled across the lake. The deputy looked uncomfortable. Finally, he turned to Karen. This is private property. You can't compel inspection here. Karen's face went red. But he can't just say that. We've got rights. The deputy gave her a look. You don't have jurisdiction off HOA land. If you want to pursue this, you'll need to take it up in civil court. I smiled. Please do. When they left, I thought that was the end of it. But Karen Matthews wasn't the kind of person to take no as an answer. She was the kind to make it personal. A week later, I found flyers pinned to my gate. Environmental violator in our community. They read, complete with photos of me fixing my dock, suggesting I was polluting shared resources. Then came the letters. HOA complaints about unauthorized structures and unregistered recreational watercraft. They even claimed my dock violated community aesthetic guidelines. I ignored them until I got a notice from the county zoning office. Apparently, someone had filed a report accusing me of illegal shoreline modification, claiming I'd altered the natural drainage pattern of the lake, threatening Ridgeview stormwater runoff. That someone didn't even bother to hide their identity. The complaint was signed, Karen Matthews, HOA president. That's when I realized this wasn't about compliance. It was about control. And Karen wasn't going to stop until she thought she'd won. But here's the thing about trying to control something you don't understand. You never see the trap until it's already sprung. I started preparing quietly. While she spread rumors and filed nonsense complaints, I called an old friend, attorney and land surveyor, Joe Henley. Together, we compiled every deed, plat map, and environmental assessment on the property. We also pulled Ridgeview's HOA charter from the county recorder's office. And that's when we found something interesting. Buried in the legal description of Ridgeview Estates, under easements and restrictions, was a clause referencing access to adjacent bodies of water contingent upon written consent of the property owner. Written consent they never had, meaning every Ridgeview homeowner who used the walking trail down to my lake was technically trespassing, meaning their fishing pier, the one they proudly called the community dock, was built on my land. Karen had been staging meetings there, hosting HOA fundraisers, collecting dues to maintain property that wasn't theirs. It wasn't just arrogance anymore. It was fraud, and she'd given me all the evidence I needed to make it right. Or rather, make it hurt. The next weekend, I went down to the lake early, before sunrise. The water was still and black, the mist curling over the surface like breath. On the opposite shore, I could see the Ridgeview Pier, cheap lumber painted white, HOA banners fluttering proudly. I stood there for a long moment, thinking about how my grandfather used to fish from that same spot 50 years ago. Thinking about how he'd warned me. People don't respect what they don't think you'll defend. He was right. So I called Joe, and we filed a formal cease and desist order for an authorized use of private land. Every Ridgeview homeowner would receive a certified letter that week. The HOA would have 30 days to remove their dock, trails, and signage off face legal action. It wasn't revenge yet, but it was a start, because what Karen didn't know, what she couldn't possibly suspect, was that I had something even bigger planned. The valley had secrets she hadn't seen on her maps. And when she pushed one step further, when she called the cops again, that's when everything would unravel. But tell me this, if someone tries to control what you rightfully own, how far would you go to remind them where the line really is? The second time the cops came, it wasn't a golf cart parade. It was a full show, 2 patrol cars, lights flashing, sirens off but ready, parked at the mouth of my gravel driveway. The HOA board was there too, dressed like it was Judgment Day. Karen Matthews stood in the center, sunglasses perched like a crown, arms crossed, with that smug half-smile that said she thought this time she had me cornered. Mr. Cole, the officer called, stepping forward. We got a call about illegal fencing and obstruction of community property. I almost laughed. Illegal fencing? They were really reaching now. Community property. I repeated, walking toward them, calm as a man on his own front porch. You mean my land? Karen stepped forward before the deputy could reply. Don't play games, Cole. You can't just fence off Ridgeview's access path. The lake is part of the shared recreation zone. She said it loud, like she wanted everyone to hear. Behind her, a small group of Ridgeview residents had gathered, spectators to her crusade. Some held phones, recording. Some just looked uncomfortable, as though they'd shown up to a play they weren't sure they wanted tickets for. I smiled, slow and deliberate. Karen, you might want to be careful with that word. Shed. It's not as friendly as you think it is. She tilted her chin. You think you can intimidate me with your paperwork and fake claims? We're done talking. Officer, do your job. Make him take down that fence. The officer glanced at me, uncertain. You got the paperwork handy, so? Oh, I've got more than that. I turned and waved my hand. Down the hill, a white pickup rolled up, dust trailing behind it. Joe Henley stepped out, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, wearing his county surveyor badge and carrying a leather portfolio. Karen's smile faltered. Joe walked up, handed the deputy a thick folder, and said in that slow, steady voice of his, This is a certified survey of Parcel 18-002, owned by Daniel Cole, recorded and notarized by the county last week. The fence in question is well within his property line. The deputy flipped through the documents, nodding. Looks in order. Karen's voice rose an octave. That can't be right. The HOA map shows. Joe cut her off. Your developer used outdated GIS data from 20 years ago. That map isn't legally binding. Mr. Cole's deed and plat survey take precedence. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I folded my arms. You really should have checked the record before you called the cops again, Karen. Her face went crimson. You can't just steal our access. We've used that path for years. Use, I said, without permission. That's called trespassing. You're insane, she snapped. Maybe, I said, stepping closer, lowering my voice. But I'm the kind of insane that owns a dote you're standing on. The deputy cleared his throat. This is a civil issue. I can't enforce HOA bylaws off HOA land. You'll need to handle this in court. Karen turned to the residents behind her, her voice trembling with fury. You see what he's doing? He's trying to cut us off from our own community lake. Someone whispered, Wait, he owns it. Another voice. She said it was public. That was a moment I'd been waiting for, the crack in her armor, doubt spreading like wildfire through her little kingdom. That night, I knew she'd come at me harder. And she did. 2 days later, I received notice of a civil complaint. The HOA had filed for an injunction, claiming that my fencing violated historical access rights and that the lake was a community feature implied in the Ridgeview covenants. It was almost funny if it hadn't been so desperate, but I didn't laugh. I just waited, because I knew something Karen didn't. Ridgeview wasn't just built on bad maps. It was built on bad land. Years ago, before the HOA existed, the developers had bought their ridge parcels cheap because the valley below was protected under a watershed conservation easement. It meant no commercial development, no drainage modification, and no artificial irrigation into the valley basin. But Ridgeview, in all its suburban splendor, had built irrigation ditches that drained straight into my lake. That was a violation of the conservation easement, and technically a federal environmental offense. And who was responsible for maintaining that system? You guessed it, the Ridgeview Homeowners Association. Joe and I compiled every photo, map, and water flow record we could find. Then we filed our own counterclaim, not for harassment or trespassing, but for environmental contamination of private property. When the hearing date came, Karen strutted into the county courthouse in her best business suit, flanked by 2 lawyers in gray ties. She looked confident, maybe even smug again. But when the judge called my case and Joe presented the documentation, the color drained from her face. The maps didn't lie. Neither did the photos of Ridgeview sprinklers draining fertilizers and runoff directly into my lake. The judge frowned, tapping his pen. So, the HOA's irrigation system crosses Mr. Cole's property line. Yes, Your Honor, Joe replied, "without consent or permit." The judge turned to Karen. "Did you know about this?" Karen hesitated. Well, the system was already in place when I became president." "That's not what your annual report says." Joe cut in, flipping open a binder. "You signed a budget line item last year for maintenance of lake drainage infrastructure." The courtroom went silent. The judge leaned back. "So you maintained illegal infrastructure on private land, then called law enforcement on the landowner when he asserted his rights." Karen's jaw clenched. "That's not." He raised a hand. "Enough." When he finally spoke the ruling, it hit like thunder. The court affirmed my ownership of the entire valley and lake. The HOA was ordered to remove all structures and drainage systems from my land within 60 days. They were also fined for environmental damage and an authorized use of private property. Karen Matthews was personally named in the order for willful misconduct. She nearly collapsed in her chair. A month later, Ridgeview looked different. The community dock was gone, ripped up plank by plank. The trail access was closed, fencing replaced with clear boundary markers. The HOA's perfect illusion of control had crumbled. Word spread fast. Residents whispered in driveways and at barbecues. Some apologized when they saw me at the hardware store. A few even thanked me. Apparently, Karen's leadership hadn't been quite as beloved as she thought. But I wasn't done, because revenge isn't always about payback. Sometimes it's about education. So I put up a new sign at the head of the valley. Polished wood, engraved in gold letters. Coal Valley Nature Reserve. Private property access by invitation only. Below it, a smaller plaque. Respect the land, and it'll respect you. Try to own it, and it'll own you. That was my grandfather's saying. And for the first time, I understood what he meant. A few weeks later, I got a letter. Not from the HOA. Karen was gone by then, voted out in a spectacular emergency meeting, but from the new board president. He wanted to meet. When he arrived, he wasn't what I expected. Young, calm, and respectful. He apologized for everything, said they wanted to make peace and discuss a possible lease agreement for limited lake access for residents, under my terms. I listened. Then I nodded. Maybe, but we start with respect. No more assumptions. He agreed. And just like that, Ridgeview learned to coexist with a valley it had once tried to control. As for Karen Matthews, she moved out 6 months later. Rumor was she tried to sue the developer for misrepresentation. It went nowhere. The last I heard, she was living 3 towns over, still trying to run an HOA. Some people never learn. One evening, long after it was all over, I stood on my dock watching the sunset bleed across the water. The air was quiet, the kind of stillness that hums after a storm. The fence glinted in the last light. On the far ridge, Ridgeview's rooftops were tiny silhouettes against the sky, like pieces on a board I'd already won. Joe's voice echoed in my head from months earlier. "You didn't just defend your land, Dan. You reminded them who owns the ground they stand on." I smiled, a slow, satisfied smile, because that's what revenge really is. Not shouting, not fighting. It's patience. It's the power of truth, sharpened by time, aimed precisely where arrogance lives. And in the end, when the dust settles, the land always remembers who it belongs to. The valley was mine. Always had been. Always would be. And now, so is my peace.